Welcome to another thrilling story on Stories TH. Have you ever wondered if a simple housekeeper could have the talent to change the culinary world of a five-star hotel? Well, stay tuned and find out how Eleanor Dawson's unexpected skills in flavor detection turned her life upside down. If you're enjoying this journey, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to Stories TH for more amazing stories. Eleanor Dawson struggled to keep her eyes open, but exhaustion pulled her down like a heavy blanket. For the past week, she had been covering extra shifts, working both mornings and nights, trying to help out a coworker who always had an excuse to skip work. Today was no different. She had spent the entire day cleaning VIP suites, and now the Penthouse was her final stop. Dragging her cleaning cart behind her, Eleanor stepped into the luxurious suite, her feet feeling like they were sinking into cement. The place was unreal: high ceilings, sophisticated decor, and a panoramic view of New York City. But it was the bathroom that really stunned her. It was bigger than her entire apartment, complete with a massive soaking tub, marble floors, and shelves stocked with expensive toiletries. She bent down to scrub around the bathtub, resting her head on her arm for just a moment. Just 5 seconds. That's all she needed. Just a tiny break before she finished up. But sleep crept up faster than she anticipated, and before she knew it, she had drifted off, right there on the toilet lid. Nathaniel Carter entered his penthouse suite after a long night at a corporate event. His shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, his tie was loose, and all he wanted was a hot shower and silence. But when he stepped into his bathroom, he froze. There was someone sitting on his toilet. No sleeping on his toilet. A woman, dressed in a hotel housekeeping uniform, her head resting against her arm, her breathing steady. For a moment, Nathaniel thought he was hallucinating. What the hell is this? What the? His voice echoed through the spacious bathroom, nearly shattering the mirrors. The woman jolted awake like she had been struck by lightning. Her eyes flew open in panic, and in her rush to sit up, she accidentally knocked over the cleaning bucket. Water and disinfectant splashed across the pristine marble floor. "Oh my God, what's happening?" she gasped, her brain still catching up. Nathaniel took a full step back, as if she were a ghost crawling out of the drain. "Who are you? And what the hell are you doing in my bathroom?" Eleanor, still half asleep and completely disoriented, stared up at him, a tall man, dark hair, intense expression, and extremely shirtless. Her mind snapped into focus. Big bathroom, expensive toiletries, hotel uniform. Oh no! She widened her eyes in horror. "I swear I didn't steal anything," she blurted out. Nathaniel blinked. "What? I just fell asleep here," she added quickly, then winced. That sounded bad. Nathaniel pinched the bridge of his nose, exhaling sharply. "Let me get this straight. You decided to nap in my bathroom? Or is sleeping on toilet lids just a normal part of your cleaning technique?" Eleanor stammered. It's not what it looks like. I mean, it is, but she trailed off, realizing there was no way to make this sound better. Nathaniel ran a hand through his hair, his exhaustion morphing into pure disbelief. "So, my penthouse bathroom is a dormitory now?" "It was just for a second," she protested. "Oh sure," he said dryly. "Just a casual 30-minute nap on the toilet." "It was 5 minutes," she shot back defensively. Nathaniel crossed his arms, raising an eyebrow. "Do you have a stopwatch in your brain?" Eleanor swallowed hard. "This is it. I'm getting fired. Any second now." He was going to call security and have her thrown out. But instead of yelling at her again, Nathaniel let out a deep sigh. He glanced at her uniform, at the way she looked like she hadn't had a full night's sleep in weeks. Something about the situation was so absurd that instead of being furious, he found himself curious. "How many hours do you work a day?" he asked, his voice calmer now. Eleanor hesitated. 16. Nathaniel's brow furrowed. 16? That's 2 full shifts. She shrugged. Someone has to pay the rent. He studied her for a moment, taking in the exhaustion on her face, the dark circles under her eyes, the way she barely seemed to be holding herself up. There was something about her, a quiet resilience, a determination that made him hesitate. Instead of firing her, he turned and walked toward the kitchen. Eleanor, stunned, scrambled after him. "Wait, am I fired?" Nathaniel didn't answer. Instead, he grabbed a cup from the counter, poured himself a coffee, and handed it to her. "Drink this." Eleanor blinked. "What? You scared the hell out of me in my own bathroom. The least you can do is taste this and tell me if it's drinkable." Confused, but not wanting to push her luck, Eleanor took the cup and hesitantly sniffed the coffee. The second she did, she made a face. "This is terrible." Nathaniel raised an eyebrow. "You can tell just by the smell." Eleanor wrinkled her nose. "The beans were over-roasted, which makes it bitter. Whoever made this tried to cover it up with sugar, but that just made it worse." Nathaniel's curiosity deepened. He stared at her like she was some kind of puzzle he needed to solve. "You figured all that out just from one sniff?" he asked. Eleanor shuffled awkwardly. "I mean, it's just obvious." Nathaniel was silent for a moment, then suddenly smirked a rare, amused expression. "Perfect," he said. Eleanor frowned. "Perfect? You just got yourself a new job," Nathaniel said, leaning against the counter. Eleanor froze. "What? You work at this hotel, right? That means you eat the food here, too." "Sometimes," she admitted. Nathaniel set the coffee cup down. "Then from now on, you're going to help me fix this problem." Eleanor laughed incredulously. "What, just because I said your coffee sucks?" "Yes," he said simply. "I'm a housekeeper, not a food critic." Nathaniel shrugged. "As of now, you're both." Eleanor gawked at him. "This is ridiculous." Nathaniel crossed his arms. "You don't have to be a food expert. You already are." She opened her mouth to argue, but stopped. He wasn't joking. He was completely serious. "Wait, you're not really making me do this, are you?" she asked. Nathaniel gave her a knowing smirk. "Collins, I never say things I don't mean." Eleanor sat stiffly in the executive dining room, her hands clasped at her lap as she took in the surreal scene before her. A pristine white tablecloth, polished silverware, and an array of perfectly plated dishes a world away from the cleaning carts and supply closets she was used to. Across from her, Nathaniel Carter leaned back in a chair, watching her with an unreadable expression, his fingers lightly drumming against the table. "All right, Dawson," he said, nodding toward the food in front of her. "You claim you can spot what's wrong with coffee just by the smell. Let's see if your so-called talent extends beyond caffeine." Eleanor narrowed her eyes. "You dragged me here just to prove I was wrong." Nathaniel smirked. "Oh no, I dragged you here because I like watching people fail when they overestimate themselves." Eleanor clenched her jaw. "You want me to fail? Fine. Let's see how that works out for him." Taking a deep breath, she picked up a fork and stabbed a piece of salmon. The second it hit her tongue, she stopped chewing, her brows furrowing. "Something wrong?" Nathaniel asked, feigning innocence. Eleanor wiped her mouth with a napkin and gave him a flat look. "The fish is overcooked. It's dry and lacks seasoning. Feels like they try to mask it with too much lemon, which only makes it worse." Nathaniel's smirk faltered. Eleanor moved on, taking a bite of the side dish, some kind of fancy risotto. She chewed, her lips pressing together. "Whoever made this used the wrong rice. It's not creamy like it should be. Either they cooked it too fast, or they didn't use enough broth." The room was silent. Even the waitstaff, standing by the wall, looked shocked. Eleanor shrugged and reached for the breadbasket. One bite, and she winced. This was baked yesterday, maybe even longer. It's slightly stale, probably microwaved before serving, which is why the crust feels weird. Nathaniel raised an eyebrow, crossing his arms. "And the juice?" Eleanor picked up a glass of what looked like fresh orange juice and took a sip. Her entire face scrunched up. "Oh, this is tragic." Nathaniel tilted his head. "Tragic." She set the glass down, shaking her head. "Someone mixed fresh juice with store-bought concentrate. And not just any concentrate, the cheap kind. The acidity is all over the place, and they added too much sugar to compensate." She looked up at him. "This is a five-star hotel, right? Because this tastes like it came from an airport food court." Nathaniel didn't say anything for a moment. The executive chef, Eduardo, who had been standing behind him, looked ready to throw a knife at her. "This is an insult," Eduardo finally snapped. "I have years of experience, and what exactly is your qualification again?" "Scrubbing floors." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "If I can figure out what's wrong with your food in under 5 minutes, what does that say about your years of experience?" Eduardo's face turned red. Nathaniel let out a low chuckle, his amusement barely hidden. She's got a point. Eduardo shot him an incredulous look. Sir, you can't seriously be listening to... Nathaniel held up a hand. That's enough. Eleanor braced herself, expecting him to finally tell her to get out. She had pushed too far, hadn't she? But instead of looking angry, Nathaniel looked intrigued. You know, he said slowly, tapping a finger against the table. I brought you here expecting you to embarrass yourself. I thought you'd say some nonsense, and I'd get a good laugh out of it. He leaned forward. But now I'm actually impressed. Eleanor blinked. Wait, what? Nathaniel ignored her shock and turned to Eduardo. Everything she pointed out, I've complained about those exact things for months. And yet, you and your team keep serving me the same garbage. Eduardo clenched his jaw. Sir, we follow industry standards. I don't give a damn about industry standards if our guests are leaving bad reviews, Nathaniel snapped. This is my hotel, and I refuse to serve mediocrity. He turned back to Eleanor. So tell me, Dawson, you seem to know everything that's wrong. Do you know how to fix it? Eleanor hesitated. I mean, better ingredients, better preparation, better oversight. Nathaniel nodded. Then congratulations. You're about to get a crash course in fixing this disaster. She stared at him. Wait, what? I'm giving you a job, Nathaniel said simply. For the next month, you'll work alongside Eduardo and help revamp the hotel's menu. Eduardo looked like he was about to have a heart attack. Excuse me. Eleanor was equally stunned. Oh, what? I can't do that. I clean rooms. I have no experience running a kitchen. Nathaniel smirked. Neither do most of the idiots I've hired, apparently. Eduardo slammed his hands on the table. Sir, this is outrageous. You're putting a housekeeper in charge of fine dining? She doesn't belong here. Nathaniel glanced at Eleanor, then back at Eduardo. His voice was calm but sharp. Then prove me wrong. If she's as unqualified as you say, it should be easy to make her fail, right? He leaned back. Or is she actually better than your entire team? Eduardo's face twitched. Eleanor swallowed. What the hell is happening right now? Nathaniel turned to her, his voice softer. You have an undeniable talent, Dawson. If you can spot the flaws, you can help fix them. Work with Eduardo. Help me make this hotel's dining experience as perfect as it should be. Eleanor hesitated, her heart pounding. This was insane. This was ridiculous. This was not what she signed up for. And yet, she thought about her life, about scrubbing floors, folding sheets, being invisible. Always working, never being seen. And now someone saw her. You really want me to do this? She asked quietly. Nathaniel nodded. I do. Eleanor inhaled sharply. And if I say no? Nathaniel smirked. Then I'll just keep making you taste terrible food until you give in. She let out a frustrated groan, running a hand through her hair. This is a terrible idea. Nathaniel grinned. Maybe, but it's also a golden opportunity. Eleanor sighed heavily, her mind racing. This was madness. It was a disaster waiting to happen. But somehow, it felt like the first real chance she'd ever gotten. Fine, she muttered. Nathaniel's eyes gleamed with satisfaction. Good. Welcome to your new nightmare, Dawson. Breaking barriers, Eleanor stood at the entrance of the Scott Hotel's executive kitchen the next morning, arms crossed, feeling like a complete outsider despite yesterday's small victory. The moment she stepped inside, the entire staff fell silent. A few exchanged looks, some openly scowled, while others whispered behind their hands. It didn't take a genius to figure out what they were thinking. She didn't belong here. And honestly, she wasn't sure they were wrong. Before she could second-guess herself, a familiar gruff voice cut through the silence. You're late. James Sullivan. The executive chef stood at the stainless steel counter, arms folded, a scowl permanently etched onto his face. His staff, all dressed in crisp white jackets, stood behind him like an army waiting for orders. Eleanor checked the time on her phone. I'm exactly on time. James arched a brow. Exactly on time means you're already behind. Eleanor sighed. So this is how it was going to be. Nathaniel appeared beside her, hands tucked into the pockets of his expensive suit. You seem tense, James. Don't tell me you're still upset about last night. James shot him a glare. Upset? No. Annoyed? Definitely. He turned back to Eleanor. She pointed out one mistake. That doesn't make her qualified to be here. Nathaniel smirked. Then let's put her to work. James didn't like that one bit. He let out a sharp breath before turning to his team. All right, we're preparing dishes for the new tasting menu today. You all know your assignments. He then looked at Eleanor, eyes glinting with challenge. You stay out of the way. Eleanor felt a flicker of irritation, but bit back her retort. Fine, let him think she was useless. For the next hour, she stood near the prep station, watching the chefs move with mechanical precision. They worked like a well-oiled machine, chopping, searing, plating. It was impressive, but as dishes started coming together, Eleanor couldn't help but notice the same problem from before. Something was off. She stepped closer to one of the junior chefs, who was adding sauce to a plated dish. Too much. Hey, she said, leaning in, you might want to ease up on that. The sauce is overpowering the dish. The chef froze, looking at her as if she'd just insulted his entire bloodline. James, who had been checking another dish, immediately noticed the interaction. Something wrong, Dawson? Eleanor hesitated, but then squared her shoulders. The sauce is too heavy. It's drowning the other flavors. James's jaw tightened. That's how it's supposed to be. Eleanor shook her head. Not if you want the dish to be balanced. You're covering up the natural flavors instead of enhancing them. A tense silence settled over the kitchen. James slowly turned to the chef. Taste it. The young man swallowed nervously before taking a bite. Almost immediately, his expression shifted. He hesitated, then nodded. She's right, chef. Murmurs rippled through the room. Even the staff had noticed. Eleanor fought the urge to smirk. James, however, looked livid. He yanked a spoon from the counter, took a bite of the dish himself, and then slammed the utensil down. I want it redone, he barked. And get it right this time. Eleanor didn't flinch. Nathaniel, meanwhile, looked highly amused. Well, looks like she might actually be useful after all. James gritted his teeth. Don't get comfortable, Dawson. You're still just a housekeeper playing chef. Eleanor met his glare without backing down. Then I guess it's time to prove I'm more than that. Later that day, Eleanor sat in Nathaniel's office, her arms crossed as he poured himself a glass of scotch. You had fun today, didn't you? He asked, smirking. Eleanor exhaled. James is impossible. Nathaniel chuckled, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. He's used to being the best. Having someone challenge him, especially someone like you, bruises his ego. Eleanor rolled her eyes. I don't care about his ego. I care about fixing the damn menu. Nathaniel's smirk faded slightly, his gaze turning more thoughtful. Why do you care? She hesitated. Why did she care? Because for the first time in a long time, she was doing something that mattered. She wasn't just another invisible worker in the background. She had a voice. And for once, people were starting to listen. She looked at Nathaniel, her voice quieter now. Because I can actually make a difference here. Nathaniel studied her for a long moment before setting down his glass. Then keep proving it. That evening, Eleanor was heading out for the night when she spotted James standing by the hotel bar, a drink in hand, watching her. She considered ignoring him, then decided against it. She walked over. Expecting an apology, James let out a sharp laugh. Hardly. He sipped his drink, then gave her a sidelong glance. You're not what I expected. She raised an eyebrow. What did you expect? James leaned against the bar, swirling his glass. Some clueless, overconfident nobody who would crumble under pressure. Eleanor smirked. Sorry to disappoint you. He scoffed. I'm not apologizing. But don't think for a second that means I'm going to make this easy for you. Eleanor met his gaze without hesitation. Good. I don't like things easy. James studied her for a moment, then let out a reluctant chuckle. You're going to be a pain in my ass, aren't you? She grinned. Absolutely. For the first time, his expression softened just a little. Maybe they weren't completely at war after all. Unlikely alliances the next morning, Eleanor arrived at the hotel's executive kitchen feeling a mixture of determination and exhaustion. She hadn't slept much. Her mind was still spinning from yesterday's events, from James's reluctant acknowledgement of her skills to Nathaniel's cryptic encouragement. She knew one thing for certain. If she wanted to survive in this world, She had to prove herself again and again. The tension in the kitchen was palpable. The other chefs still regarded her with skepticism, their eyes following her as if waiting for her to make a mistake. Well, they'd be waiting a long time. James stood at the center of the kitchen, barking orders as his team prepared the next batch of dishes for the tasting panel. Nathaniel had invited a select group of food critics and investors, hoping to impress them with an updated menu. It was an opportunity and a test. James turned to Eleanor, arms crossed. "All right, since you're so eager to play expert, you'll be part of the tasting panel." Eleanor arched a brow. "Oh, thought you didn't trust my opinion." James smirked. "I don't. But if you mess this up, at least I'll get the satisfaction of seeing you fail in front of an audience." Eleanor grinned. "Careful, Sullivan. You might end up agreeing with me again." A few nearby chefs snickered, and James shot them a glare. The tasting panel begins. The small private dining room was set with crystal-clear glasses, elegantly folded napkins, and pristine white plates as the first round of dishes was placed in front of the panel. Nathaniel sat at the head of the table, his expression unreadable. On one side sat a renowned food critic, Robert Langford, a sharp-eyed man with salt and pepper hair who rarely gave positive reviews. On the other, a few key investors watched closely, their pens poised over evaluation sheets. And then there was Eleanor, sitting directly across from James, who looked way too entertained by her discomfort. The first dish was set before them, a seared duck breast with a cherry reduction and truffle-infused mashed potatoes. Eleanor picked up her fork and took a bite. Immediately, she frowned. James noticed. "Problem, Dawson?" Eleanor dabbed her lips with her napkin. "The sauce is overreduced. It's too syrupy, it drowns out the natural richness of the duck." James smirked, turning to Robert Langford. "I suppose our food critic here will be the judge of that." Langford took his own bite, chewing thoughtfully before nodding. "She's right. The sauce is cloying." James's expression dropped slightly, but he quickly masked it with a neutral nod. "Noted." Eleanor bit back a victorious smile. The next dish was served lobster ravioli with a saffron cream sauce. Eleanor took a bite and immediately winced. Too much saffron. It overpowers the delicacy of a lobster. James exhaled through his nose, clearly irritated. "Dawson, maybe you should." Langford interrupted. "She's correct again. The saffron is too strong." One of the investors murmured something to his colleague, writing something on his evaluation sheet. James's jaw tightened. Dish after dish was presented, and dish after dish, Eleanor called out flaws the others had overlooked. Some were minor, some were glaring, but all were valid. By the time the tasting ended, James looked exhausted. Nathaniel leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers against the table. "Well, I think it's safe to say that we have a lot of adjustments to make." Langford wiped his mouth with his napkin and looked at James. "Your execution is skilled, but your balance is off. You're relying too much on overpowering flavors instead of refinement." James muttered something under his breath, clearly irritated. Langford then turned to Eleanor, his gaze unreadable. "And you?" Eleanor straightened. "You have an impressive palate," Langford said. "I don't know where you came from, but you belong in this industry." A hush fell over the table. James blinked. Nathaniel smirked. One of the investors nodded in approval. Eleanor grinned. James, however, didn't look happy. He pushed back his chair and stood. "Excuse me, I need to get back to work." Eleanor watched as he stormed out of the dining room. Nathaniel chuckled. "I'd say that went well." Eleanor exhaled, her heart still racing from the moment. She had just outperformed one of the best chefs in the city in front of some of the most important people in the business. And now, there was no turning back. Later that night, Eleanor was in the hotel's lounge, nursing a glass of wine, when she heard a heavy sigh behind her. She turned to see James, standing there with a scowl. She smirked. "Come to admit defeat?" James shook his head and slid onto the bar stool beside her. "Don't get cocky, Dawson." She laughed. Too late. For a moment, they sat in silence. The tension between them wasn't gone, but it was different now. After a while, James ran a hand through his hair and muttered, "You were right. About the dishes." Eleanor blinked. "Wait, did you just—" "Shut up." James grumbled, taking a sip of his drink. Eleanor grinned. I think that's the closest thing to a compliment I'll ever get from you. James exhaled, then turned to face her fully. Look, I don't like being wrong, and I definitely don't like outsiders coming in and telling me how to do my job. Eleanor crossed her arms. Not an outsider anymore, Sullivan. James smirked, lifting his glass in mock surrender. Apparently not. They clinked glasses, an unspoken truce forming between them. But Eleanor knew that this was just the beginning. There were still bigger battles ahead. A new rivalry begins the next morning. Eleanor walked into the kitchen with a newfound confidence. After the tasting panel, she knew she had made an impact. She wasn't just some housekeeper stumbling into the culinary world. She had earned her place. But not everyone was thrilled about it. James was more composed than the night before, but his expression was as unreadable as ever. His team, however, had become more divided. Some had started to respect Eleanor's palate, while others still viewed her as an unqualified outsider. And then there was Isabel Lauron. She was James's second-in-command, a highly trained sous chef with years of experience in Michelin-starred kitchens. Unlike James, she didn't hide her contempt for Eleanor. Eleanor had barely stepped into the kitchen when she heard Isabel's sharp voice. So, the hotel's new food expert finally decided to show up. Isabel was leaning against the counter, arms crossed, eyes gleaming with mockery. Eleanor gave a tight smile. I'm not late, if that's what you're implying. Isabel shrugged. Not late, but still in the wrong place. This is a kitchen, not a hobby club. The tension in the room thickened. Some of the chefs exchanged uneasy glances, while others smirked, waiting for Eleanor's response. Eleanor tilted her head. That's funny, because from what I remember, I was the only one at yesterday's tasting panel who actually caught all of the mistakes. A few chefs murmured, and James pinched the bridge of his nose, clearly not in the mood for another battle. Isabel, however, didn't back down. She stepped forward, her expression cool but calculated. You got lucky. Anyone can point out mistakes. It doesn't mean you know how to fix them. Eleanor didn't flinch. Then let's find out. James let out a low groan. Dawson, but Isabel smirked. Oh, you want to prove yourself? Eleanor crossed her arms. I think I already have. Then let's take it a step further, Isabel challenged. You say you have a good palate? Fine. Let's see if you can do more than just criticize. Let's see if you can actually create. Eleanor raised a brow. What are you suggesting? A challenge, Isabel said, her voice dripping with confidence. You and me. A blind taste test, followed by a dish creation challenge. Eleanor stilled. She was good at identifying flaws, but she had never actually cooked in a professional setting. She didn't have years of training or a culinary degree, and Isabel knew it. James sighed, rubbing his temple. Isabel, this is ridiculous. But Nathaniel had just walked in, and he smiled in amusement. I think it sounds like an excellent idea. Eleanor whipped her head toward him. Excuse me? Nathaniel leaned against the doorway, clearly enjoying the show. You've already proven you can analyze food, but Isabel's right, creating it is a different story. So, why not settle this properly? Isabel smirked. Exactly. James shot Nathaniel an exasperated look. Are you seriously encouraging this? Nathaniel shrugged. Why not? A little competition never hurt anyone. Eleanor's stomach twisted, but she forced herself to remain calm. If she backed down now, Isabel and everyone else doubting her would win, and she couldn't let that happen. Fine, Eleanor said, her voice steady. Let's do it. The blind taste test later that afternoon, the chefs gathered in the private dining area to witness the competition. Small containers of ingredients were set in front of Eleanor and Isabel, each covered to prevent them from seeing what they were tasting. Nathaniel stood to the side, arms crossed, while James grimaced, already anticipating the disaster. All right, Nathaniel announced. Rules are simple. You'll each be blindfolded and given ingredients to identify. Whoever gets the most correct wins the first round. A kitchen assistant tied a black blindfold over Eleanor's eyes. You ready for this? Nathaniel asked. Eleanor took a deep breath. More than ever, the first ingredient was placed on her tongue. She focused, letting the flavors unravel. She exhaled slowly, then spoke. Cardamom. Correct, Nathaniel confirmed. Next, a soft texture, a hint of citrus, a mild peppery aftertaste, finger lime. Correct. One by one, the ingredients came. Some are easy: vanilla bean, saffron, truffle oil. Others were more complex. She hesitated on one, almost mistaking white miso for tahini, but caught herself just in time. When the round ended, the results were clear. Eleanor wins, Nathaniel declared. A low murmur spread across the room. Isabel didn't look pleased. Eleanor smirked, pulling off her blindfold. What's next? Isabel's jaw tightened, but she didn't back down. Now we cook. The dish creation challenge. The final test was even more daunting. The challenge? Create a dish using a mystery basket of ingredients. Isabel moved with practiced ease, grabbing ingredients, slicing, searing. She was fast, efficient, and ruthless. Her hands moved like she had been born in a kitchen. Eleanor, on the other hand, took a different approach. She studied the flavors before touching anything. Instead of rushing, she built the concept in her mind, carefully balancing the flavors. Time ticked down. Nathaniel and James watched, both intrigued. At the final minute, Eleanor plated her dish, a seared scallop with citrus beurre blanc, complemented by roasted fennel and a hint of black garlic. Nathaniel took the first bite. His brows lifted slightly, but he said nothing. Next was Isabel's, a perfectly cooked duck breast with a red wine reduction, infused with pomegranate and star anise. James tasted both, then turned to Nathaniel. What do you think? Nathaniel leaned back, his eyes gleaming. They're both excellent. Eleanor held her breath. But, Nathaniel continued, Eleanor's dish was more balanced. A beat of silence. Isabel's eyes flashed with irritation. Eleanor's heart pounded. She had won. Nathaniel smirked. I think we all know what that means. James exhaled slowly, shaking his head. Well, I'll be damned. Eleanor turned to Isabel, expecting her to lash out, but instead, she just stared at her for a long moment before nodding. Fine. You got me this time. Nathaniel clapped his hands. Then I think it's time we make things official. Eleanor frowned. Official. Nathaniel grinned. Eleanor, how would you like to be the new guest experience consultant for the Scott Hotel chain? Eleanor's mouth fell open. James sighed, muttering under his breath. Oh, this is going to be interesting. And for the first time since stepping into this world, Eleanor realized something. She wasn't just a housekeeper anymore. She was a force to be reckoned with. The weight of expectations. Eleanor stood in Nathaniel's office, still trying to process what had just happened. Guest experience consultant. It was a fancy title, but what did it actually mean? What was she supposed to do? Nathaniel leaned back in his chair, watching her reaction with amusement. You look like you're about to run out the door. She exhaled sharply. That's because I might. Nathaniel smirked. Too late for that. He slid a contract across the desk. Here's the official offer. Salary included. Eleanor hesitated before picking it up. The numbers made her blink. It was more money than she had ever made in her life. This is a lot, she admitted. It's what you're worth, Nathaniel said simply. Eleanor's chest tightened. Was she worth this? Nathaniel studied her for a moment, then leaned forward. Listen, Dawson. You proved something yesterday. You're not just good, you're exceptional. And I don't offer positions like this on a whim. Eleanor looked down at the contract, her fingers tightening around the paper. What if I fail? She asked quietly. Nathaniel didn't hesitate. Then you learn. There was something about the way he said it, so matter-of-fact, so unwavering, that made Eleanor feel like maybe, just maybe, she could actually do this. She took a deep breath, grabbed the pen, and signed. Nathaniel's grin widened. Welcome to the executive team. Thrown into the deep end. Eleanor barely had time to process her new role before she was thrown straight into her first challenge. The Scott Hotel chain was about to host a high-profile gala. Top investors, food critics, and media representatives would be in attendance. Nathaniel wanted her to oversee the guest experience, making sure every dish, every drink, and every detail was flawless, which meant working closely with James and Isabel, which meant dealing with a lot of hostility. She walked into the kitchen that afternoon, only to be met with silence. The team was working, but the tension in the air was thick. James looked up and crossed his arms. Ah, our new consultant has arrived. The sarcasm in his voice was palpable. Isabel didn't even bother looking at her. Eleanor took a deep breath. I know this is an adjustment, but I'm here to make things better, not to step on anyone's toes. James let out a short laugh. You already did that when you beat Isabel yesterday. A few chefs snickered, while Isabel's jaw clenched. Eleanor ignored them. She walked over to the prep station and picked up a menu for the gala. The first course, she began, scanning the details. You're using black truffle with a citrus reduction. James raised an eyebrow. And it's too much, Eleanor said, shaking her head. The truffle is already rich. Pairing it with something acidic is going to clash. Isabel snorted. Since when did a housekeeper become a food expert? Eleanor met her gaze head-on. Since I saved you from serving a terrible breakfast. A beat of silence. Then James let out a low chuckle. She's got a point. Isabel's eyes flashed, but she didn't argue. Eleanor set the menu down. Look, I know this isn't ideal, but I want this to be the best gala this hotel has ever hosted. And for that to happen, we all need to work together. James studied her for a long moment before nodding slowly. Fine, but if you're going to critique, you'd better back it up. Eleanor nodded. Deal. A closer look at Nathaniel. That evening, Eleanor found herself on the rooftop terrace, taking a moment to breathe. The day had been chaotic. Between menu adjustments, wine pairings, and seating arrangements, she barely had time to process everything. You look exhausted. Eleanor turned to see Nathaniel approaching, holding 2 glasses of wine. She raised an eyebrow. Is that your way of saying I look terrible? Nathaniel smirked. Not terrible. Just like someone who's realizing how much work this job actually is. Eleanor sighed, accepting the glass. It's a lot. Welcome to my world. She took a sip, then looked at him. Why did you pick me? Nathaniel's expression softened slightly. Because you see things others don't. Eleanor frowned. You didn't even know that before I accidentally fell asleep in your bathroom. Nathaniel chuckled. True, but after that, I paid attention. You have instincts most professionals spend years trying to develop. Eleanor looked away, swirling the wine in her glass. It still feels surreal. Nathaniel leaned on the railing beside her. You know what my first job was? She shook her head. Dishwasher. At a rundown diner. I hated it. Eleanor blinked. Wait, you started as a dishwasher? He nodded. Worked my way up. Got fired from my first managerial job because I didn't fit the image. Eleanor stared at him. I thought you were born into this world. Nathaniel smiled, but there was a hint of something else in his eyes. I had to fight for my place just like you. For the first time, Eleanor saw him differently. Not just as the untouchable CEO, but as someone who had been in her shoes. And for some reason, that made everything a little less scary. The beginning of something more. As the night went on, Eleanor and Nathaniel talked more than they ever had before. About food, about business, about the pressure of expectations. Somewhere along the way, she stopped feeling like she was talking to her boss and started feeling like she was talking to someone who understood her. And Nathaniel? He couldn't shake the feeling that Eleanor was someone he didn't want to lose. But neither of them was ready to admit it just yet, because the gala was coming. And with it, the real test. A night of high stakes, the night of the gala arrived faster than Eleanor expected. The grand ballroom of the Scott Hotel was transformed into a masterpiece of elegant crystal chandeliers, gold accents, a live orchestra playing softly in the background. It was the kind of event Eleanor had only ever seen in magazines. Except tonight, she wasn't here to clean, she was here to prove herself. She stood near the entrance, watching as guests arrived, elite business people, critics, and investors, all dressed in their finest. Her stomach twisted. This is insane, she muttered under her breath. You get used to it. Nathaniel's voice came from beside her. She turned to find him looking effortlessly polished in a tailored black suit. Doubt it, she murmured. Nathaniel smirked. Then consider this a trial by fire. She exhaled sharply, forcing herself to focus. Tonight wasn't about feeling out of place. It was about making sure everything went flawlessly. The first test. Eleanor made her way to the kitchen, where James and his team were plating the first course. She grabbed a plate and examined it pan-seared scallops with a saffron-infused puree. Visually perfect, but when she brought the dish closer to her nose, something felt off. James, noticing her hesitation, sighed. "What now?" Eleanor frowned. "The saffron. It's overpowering." James crossed his arms. "It's supposed to be." She shook her head. "Not like this. Did you change suppliers?" James looked toward one of his sous chefs, who nodded. "Yeah. New batch came in this morning." Eleanor glanced at Nathaniel, who had just walked in. "The saffron is too strong. It's masking the natural sweetness of the scallops." Nathaniel didn't hesitate. "Fix it." James muttered something under his breath, but nodded to his team. Within minutes, the plating was adjusted, the puree toned down. As the first plates went out, Eleanor felt a small surge of pride. One crisis averted. Not everyone is happy, but not everyone was thrilled with Eleanor's presence. As she walked through the ballroom, ensuring everything was running smoothly, she caught whispers. "She's just a maid. Why is she making decisions? Sleeping with the boss, probably." Eleanor's jaw tightened. She tried to ignore it, but the words stuck. She wasn't just fighting to prove herself to Nathaniel, she was fighting to prove herself to everyone in this room. And then, Isabel made her move. The pastry chef approached with a smug expression, holding a tray of delicate petit fours. "Want to critique these two?" she asked sweetly. Eleanor picked one up, examined it, then took a bite. Her brow furrowed. "Something's wrong," she said, swallowing. James, overhearing, walked over. "What do you mean?" Eleanor hesitated, trying to pinpoint the issue. "The flavor is off. There's a strange bitterness at the end." Isabel folded her arms. Everything was made according to exact measurements. Eleanor frowned, picking up another piece and carefully dissecting it in her mouth. Then it hit her. "The vanilla," she said. "It's synthetic, isn't it?" James visibly stiffened, while Isabel smirked. "Good catch," she said. "Unfortunately, we ran out of real vanilla and had a substitute." Eleanor turned to James. "Why wasn't I told?" James sighed. "Because there wasn't time." Eleanor glanced toward the ballroom. The desserts were about to be served. If they went out with that bitter aftertaste. Nathaniel walked up. "Problem?" Eleanor didn't hesitate. "The vanilla extract is synthetic. The bitterness lingers. It's going to ruin the final impression of the meal." Nathaniel turned to James. "Options?" James hesitated. "We can make a simple fruit coulis as a dipping sauce, something to mask the bitterness." "Do it," Nathaniel ordered without a second thought. James rushed off, but Isabel rolled her eyes. "I'm sure no one would have noticed," she muttered. Eleanor met her gaze. "I did." Isabel's smirk vanished. Eleanor didn't care. She had earned her place here, and she wasn't backing down. A moment of recognition. The night wore on, and to Eleanor's relief, the dinner was a success. Guests raved about the adjustments to the menu, and the quick fix to the dessert had saved the night. As Eleanor finally took a moment to breathe, she felt someone watching her. She turned to find Nathaniel standing nearby, hands in his pockets, an unreadable expression on his face. "You did good tonight," he finally said. Eleanor arched an eyebrow. That sounded dangerously close to a compliment. Nathaniel smirked. "Don't get used to it." Eleanor chuckled, but something warm settled in her chest. Nathaniel wasn't an easy man to impress. But tonight, she had earned his respect. And maybe, just maybe, she was starting to belong here after all. The unexpected invitation. The morning after the gala, Eleanor woke up feeling drained yet oddly satisfied. Despite the tension, the scrutiny, and the whispered doubts, she had proven herself. She had held her own against James, Isabel, and the countless critics in the room. But just as she was about to enjoy a rare morning of peace, a message from Nathaniel popped up on her phone. "Meet me at the Penthouse. 9 a.m. Don't be late." Eleanor stared at the screen. Nathaniel Carter had never personally summoned her before. Her stomach twisted. Had she made a mistake? A proposal she didn't expect. By the time she reached Nathaniel's penthouse office, she was already mentally preparing for whatever was coming. The door was open, and he was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring out over the city skyline. "I hope this isn't about last night," she said, forcing a casual tone. "Because I'm too exhausted for another argument." Nathaniel turned, a rare glint of amusement in his eyes. "Sit," he said, motioning to the leather chair across from his desk. Eleanor hesitated but obeyed. Then he dropped the bombshell. "I want you to come with me to Paris." Eleanor blinked. "Excuse me?" Nathaniel leaned against his desk. "There's an exclusive culinary event happening next week. The best chefs in the world will be there, and I need a sharp, unbiased palate to help me assess potential new hires for my restaurants." She stared at him, trying to process. "You want me?" she asked. "You have a whole team of professionals." "Yes," Nathaniel said, "and I trust them about as much as I trust a weather forecast." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "So you trust me?" A slow smirk spread across his face. "More than most." Her heart skipped at that. She glanced away, tried to focus. "But Paris? I don't even have a passport." "Taken care of. What about my job? Consider this a promotion." Eleanor froze. She had been fighting so hard just to prove her worth, to show she was more than just a housekeeper. Now, Nathaniel was offering her a future she never dared to imagine. A real chance to step into a new world. But was she ready? James is not amused. When Eleanor broke the news in the kitchen later that afternoon, James nearly choked on his coffee. "Paris," he repeated. She nodded, bracing for the inevitable sarcasm. "Let me get this straight," James said, setting his cup down. "You go from scrubbing floors to criticizing my food, and now you're flying off to Paris with the boss?" Eleanor rolled her eyes. "It's a business trip, James." "Oh, sure," he smirked. "And I'm the Queen of England." She glared at him. "This is huge for me," she said firmly. "It's a real opportunity." James studied her for a moment, the teasing expression slipping slightly. Then, with a sigh, he muttered, "Just don't get too comfortable in that world, Eleanor. People like Carter, they don't bring people up unless it benefits them." Eleanor frowned. She wanted to argue, to tell James he was wrong. But deep down, a tiny voice whispered, "What if he's right?" The whispering begins. By the end of the day, everyone in the hotel had heard the news, and the rumors started immediately. She's only going because Carter likes her. She must be sleeping with him. This is just another rich man playing with a pretty distraction. Eleanor gritted her teeth. She had worked her ass off to get here. She had proven her skills, her instincts. This wasn't some favor. Yet no matter what she did, people always found a reason to doubt her. Nathaniel's warning. That night, she found herself standing outside Nathaniel's office again. She wasn't sure why. Maybe she just needed to vent, or maybe she just needed reassurance. Before she could knock, the door swung open. Nathaniel looked at her expectantly, as if he knew she'd show up. "Something on your mind, Collins?" She crossed her arms. "I assume you've heard the whispers?" Nathaniel's expression darkened slightly. "I have." Eleanor hesitated, then blurted, "Why did you pick me for this?" Nathaniel's brows lifted. "I already told you. You have a rare talent." "But—" Nathaniel stepped closer, voice dropping. "Stop questioning yourself," he said. "I chose you because I trust your instincts, because you're not afraid to call out mistakes, and because you don't kiss anyone's ass." Eleanor swallowed. She had expected doubt, or even condescension. Not this. Nathaniel studied her for a moment, then added, "If you let them get in your head, you'll lose. Ignore them." Eleanor exhaled slowly. Maybe he was right. Maybe it was time she stopped doubting herself. "Fine," she said. "I'm going to Paris." Nathaniel smirked. "Good." And just like that, everything changed. The unexpected invitation. The morning after the gala, Eleanor woke up feeling drained yet oddly satisfied. Despite the tension, the scrutiny, and the whispered doubts, she had proven herself. She had held her own against James, Isabel, and the countless critics in the room. But just as she was about to enjoy a rare morning of peace, a message from Nathaniel popped up on her phone. "Meet me at the Penthouse. 9 a.m. Don't be late." Eleanor stared at the screen. Nathaniel Carter had never personally summoned her before. Her stomach twisted. Had she made a mistake? A proposal she didn't expect. By the time she reached Nathaniel's penthouse office, she was already mentally preparing for whatever was coming. The door was open, and he was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring out over the city skyline. "I hope this isn't about last night," she said, forcing a casual tone. "Because I'm too exhausted for another argument." Nathaniel turned, a rare glint of amusement in his eyes. "Sit," he said, motioning to the leather chair across from his desk. Eleanor hesitated but obeyed. Then he dropped the bombshell. "I want you to come with me to Paris." Eleanor blinked. "Excuse me?" Nathaniel leaned against his desk. "There's an exclusive culinary event happening next week. The best chefs in the world will be there, and I need a sharp, unbiased palate to help me assess potential new hires for my restaurants." She stared at him, trying to process. "You want me?" she asked. "You have a whole team of professionals." "Yes," Nathaniel said, "and I trust them about as much as I trust a weather forecast." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "So you trust me?" A slow smirk spread across his face. "More than most." Her heart skipped at that. She glanced away, trying to focus. "But Paris? I don't even have a passport." "Taken care of." "What about my job? Consider this a promotion." Eleanor froze. She had been fighting so hard just to prove her worth, to show she was more than just a housekeeper. Now, Nathaniel was offering her a future she never dared to imagine. A real chance to step into a new world. But was she ready? James is not amused. When Eleanor broke the news in the kitchen later that afternoon, James nearly choked on his coffee. "Paris," he repeated. She nodded, bracing for the inevitable sarcasm. "Let me get this straight," James said, setting his cup down. "You go from scrubbing floors to criticizing my food, and now you're flying off to Paris with the boss?" Eleanor rolled her eyes. "It's a business trip, James." "Oh, sure," he smirked. "And I'm the Queen of England." She glared at him. "This is huge for me," she said firmly. "It's a real opportunity." James studied her for a moment, the teasing expression slipping slightly. Then, with a sigh, he muttered, "Just don't get too comfortable in that world, Eleanor. People like Carter, they don't bring people up unless it benefits them." Eleanor frowned. She wanted to argue, to tell James he was wrong. But deep down, a tiny voice whispered, "What if he's right?" The whispering begins. By the end of the day, everyone in the hotel had heard the news, and the rumors started immediately. She's only going because Carter likes her. She must be sleeping with him. This is just another rich man playing with a pretty distraction. Eleanor gritted her teeth. She had worked her ass off to get here. She had proven her skills, her instincts. This wasn't some favor. Yet no matter what she did, people always found a reason to doubt her. Nathaniel's warning. That night, she found herself standing outside Nathaniel's office again. She wasn't sure why. Maybe she just needed to vent, or maybe she just needed reassurance. Before she could knock, the door swung open. Nathaniel looked at her expectantly, as if he knew she'd show up. "Something on your mind, Collins?" She crossed her arms. "I assume you've heard the whispers?" Nathaniel's expression darkened slightly. "I have." Eleanor hesitated, then blurted, "Why did you pick me for this?" Nathaniel's brows lifted. "I already told you. You have a rare talent." "But—" Nathaniel stepped closer, voice dropping. "Stop questioning yourself," he said. "I chose you because I trust your instincts, because you're not afraid to call out mistakes, and because you don't kiss anyone's ass." Eleanor swallowed. She had expected doubt, or even condescension. Not this. Nathaniel studied her for a moment, then added, "If you let them get in your head, you'll lose. Ignore them." Eleanor exhaled slowly. Maybe he was right. Maybe it was time she stopped doubting herself. "Fine," she said. "I'm going to Paris." Nathaniel smirked. "Good." And just like that, everything changed. The pressure intensifies. The next morning, Eleanor woke up earlier than she had planned. She sat on the edge of the impossibly soft bed in her luxury hotel suite, staring at the sunlight filtering through the sheer curtains. Today was the first major food event, the place where she'd be expected to prove herself. She took a deep breath. There was no room for doubt now. A cold welcome in the culinary world. By noon, Eleanor found herself standing in the grand hall of one of Paris's most exclusive venues. Everything around her screamed wealth, from the sparkling chandeliers to the uniformed staff pouring champagne into delicate crystal flutes. Nathaniel walked beside her, perfectly composed as always, while she felt every set of eyes locking on her the moment she stepped inside. Whispers, judging glances. She could hear their thoughts loud and clear. Who is she? Why is she here? She's just a housekeeper. Eleanor forced herself to stand tall. She wouldn't let them see her intimidated. Nathaniel's voice was calm beside her. "Don't let them get to you." Easy for him to say. She swallowed hard and nodded. "I won't." Nathaniel led her through the crowd, introducing her to chefs, critics, and investors. Some greeted her with polite indifference. Others, like James Sullivan, the executive chef, still bitter about her involvement, didn't even try to hide their disdain. "Well, look who's still here," James muttered as they crossed paths. Eleanor forced a tight smile. "Disappointed?" James scoffed, but before he could reply, Nathaniel spoke. "She's here because she belongs here. You might want to get used to it." James's expression hardened, but he said nothing, walking off instead. Eleanor exhaled slowly. That was unexpected. Nathaniel glanced at her. "You okay?" She gave him a sideways look. "Did you just offend me?" He shrugged. "I'll deny it if you tell anyone." Despite herself, she laughed. Maybe this wouldn't be so bad. The ultimate challenge. As the event progressed, Eleanor's moment finally came. A renowned French chef, Claude Martin, presented a dish meant to represent the future of fine dining. Critics surrounded the table, murmuring their approval. Eleanor, however, noticed something immediately. The scent just slightly off. The balance slightly wrong. Nathaniel watched her carefully. "Something's bothering you," he said quietly. Eleanor hesitated. This was a legendary chef. Who was she to question him? But then she remembered something Nathaniel had told her. "Trust your instincts." She picked up her fork, took a small bite, and let the flavors roll over her tongue. Then, before she could stop herself, she said, "The seasoning is masking something." Silence. Eyes turned to her. The chef Claude Martin narrowed his gaze. "Excuse me." Eleanor's heart pounded. Too late to back down now. "You added extra citrus to cover the bitterness of the sauce," she explained. "The dish isn't balanced properly. The bitterness shouldn't be there to begin with." A few murmurs. Nathaniel's expression remained unreadable. Claude stiffened. But instead of snapping, he picked up his own fork, tasted the dish, and then paused. His expression changed. "I see." More whispers rippled through the crowd. Eleanor held her breath. Then, the chef did something unexpected. He nodded at her. "You have a good palate." Eleanor blinked. Was that approval? Nathaniel smirked. And just like that, everything shifted. For the first time, Eleanor wasn't just an outsider. She was a contender. And people had started to notice. Facing the truth, the following days were a blur for Eleanor. The success at the food event had catapulted her into a strange and intimidating new world. People now whispered her name with respect, or at least curiosity, and she felt like the spotlight was permanently on her. Nathaniel had set her up with private tastings and meetings with chefs from around the world, each session designed to challenge her senses and her ability to critique at a level she never thought possible. But despite the recognition, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. The way people looked at her now, like she was something special, made her uncomfortable. The whispers and stares still followed her wherever she went, and she started to question whether she truly belonged in this world of wealth and power. The pressures of being under the microscope. It wasn't just the celebrities and chefs who had started paying attention to her. It was the media as well. A tabloid article popped up one afternoon with a headline that made Eleanor's stomach turn. "The maid who shocked Paris. Can she really be a culinary genius?" The piece was filled with speculation about her past, her rapid rise, and her relationship with Nathaniel. Of course, the media had done what it always did, twisting the story into something sensational and dramatic. They highlighted her time as a housekeeper and turned it into an angle that had nothing to do with her talent. Eleanor's phone buzzed with text messages from Carla, her closest friend at the hotel, offering sympathy and support. Carla was excited for her, but Eleanor couldn't help but feel exposed and vulnerable. She had worked so hard to get here, and now it felt like she was being torn apart by those who were supposed to celebrate her achievements. James Sullivan strikes again. The tension in the kitchen was palpable. James Sullivan, who had reluctantly accepted Eleanor's presence, seemed to grow more agitated with each passing day. During one of their daily tastings, James watched Eleanor as she carefully picked up a spoon and tasted a new dish. She furrowed her brow, analyzing the flavors before giving her honest feedback. "The sauce is too sweet," Eleanor said. "It's overpowering the rest of the ingredients. You need to balance it with a hint of acidity to round it out." James crossed his arms and rolled his eyes. "What do you know about balance? You're a housekeeper, not a chef." Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. She had grown used to the Barb comments, but this one hit a little too close to home. She glanced at Nathaniel, who had been observing from the other side of the room. His face was unreadable, but Eleanor could see the slight clenching of his jaw. He didn't approve of James's dismissive attitude, but he wasn't about to intervene just yet. Taking a deep breath, Eleanor stepped closer to the stove, ignoring James. "I may not have the title of chef, but I know good food when I taste it," she said firmly. "You might want to reconsider your approach if you plan on staying competitive in this industry." James's face turned an angry shade of red, and for a brief moment, Eleanor feared that he might lash out physically. But instead, he bit back a retort and stormed out of the kitchen. Nathaniel walked over to her, his voice low and calm. "You handle that well. Don't let him get to you." Eleanor let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. "I'm not scared of him, Nathaniel. I just don't want to keep feeling like an imposter." Nathaniel gave her a soft, reassuring smile. "You're not an imposter, Eleanor. You're a force to be reckoned with. Just keep trusting your instincts. People are starting to see that." Eleanor smiled back, but the weight of James's words still lingered in the back of her mind. Was she really cut out for this world? Or was she just fooling herself into thinking she belonged? The night of revelations later that evening, Nathaniel invited her to dinner at one of the most exclusive restaurants in Paris. Eleanor had been to many luxurious places by now, but this one was different. The dining room had a mysterious allure, and the atmosphere was one of quiet sophistication. It felt like a place where every detail had been meticulously crafted to perfection. They were seated at a private table overlooking the city. The soft glow of the lights reflected off the crystal wine glasses, and the sound of gentle conversation filled the air. Eleanor took a moment to soak in the elegance surrounding her. Nathaniel seemed at ease, as always, but Eleanor felt a strange nervousness creeping up inside her. The pressure of being constantly scrutinized had started to wear on her. Nathaniel, sensing her unease, leaned in slightly. "You've been quiet tonight. Is everything okay?" Eleanor hesitated. "I don't know. I guess I'm just overwhelmed. All this attention, all these people, it's hard to feel like I'm not faking it." Nathaniel studied her with his intense gaze, as though he were trying to read her very soul. After a moment, he said softly, "I know what it feels like to be out of place. But you need to understand something. You've earned every bit of respect you've gotten so far. None of this is by chance." Eleanor looked down at her glass, struggling to find the right words. "But what if I'm just a flavor of the week? What if everyone forgets about me once the next big thing comes along?" Nathaniel's expression softened, and he reached across the table to place his hand on hers. "No one will forget about you, Eleanor. Not as long as you keep being yourself." Eleanor felt something stir in her chest at his words, something she hadn't felt in a long time. Could it be that Nathaniel had more faith in her than she had in herself? Could it be that she did belong here, in this world of luxury, fame, and high expectations? Before she could respond, their meal arrived, and the conversation shifted to the next course. But Eleanor knew one thing for sure. The path ahead was uncertain, but it was also filled with possibility, and she was determined to keep walking it, no matter how difficult it became. The turning point, as the evening wore on, Eleanor's thoughts drifted back to Nathaniel's words. She was starting to realize that maybe she had found a place in this world. And perhaps it wasn't so much about titles or qualifications. Maybe it was about trusting her instincts and believing in her own worth. The night wasn't over, though. What came next would test her more than anything had before. But one thing was certain. Eleanor was no longer afraid of what people thought of her. She was ready to take on whatever came next, and to do it with her head held high. And just like that, everything began to shift in her favor. A world of opportunities the following week, Eleanor found herself caught between excitement and fear. The media storm, though not fully quieted, had simmered down a bit, but the whispers and speculation surrounding her continued to haunt her every step. Her mind often drifted back to the nagging thought, do I really belong here? Or am I just a fleeting moment in this world? Nathaniel, ever perceptive, noticed the shift in her demeanor. He knew Eleanor was struggling with more than just the pressures of the culinary world. She was battling her own self-doubt, and it was starting to show in the way she interacted with the team. He also knew that to truly make her see her own potential, he needed to push her even further. Eleanor was ready for something bigger, but she didn't yet know it. A new challenge one evening. As the city lights flickered outside the office window, Nathaniel approached Eleanor with a look that suggested something monumental was on the horizon. "Eleanor, I have an idea I want to run by you," he began, sitting down across from her. Eleanor felt her heart skip a beat. What now? She wondered. She had already proven herself with the culinary critiques, but something told her Nathaniel wasn't about to let her rest on her laurels. "I'm listening," she said cautiously. Nathaniel leaned forward, his eyes focused, his voice serious. "There's an upcoming international food conference in New York. It's the biggest culinary event of the year, attended by the best chefs, critics, and food enthusiasts from all over the world." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "Sounds like a big deal." Nathaniel nodded, a slight smile playing at the corners of his lips. "It is. But here's the thing, there's one spot left for a guest speaker, someone to present a new approach to food that could revolutionize the industry. And I want you to take it." Eleanor's eyes widened. "Wait, what? Me? Present?" "Yes," Nathaniel replied, his voice firm but encouraging. "You have a unique perspective on food, one that's more intuitive than anything we've seen in years. You've helped improve the dishes at the hotel and at every event you've been a part of. You've earned this." The shock hit her like a ton of bricks. She had never imagined herself speaking at such a prestigious event, let alone in front of hundreds of industry giants. She opened her mouth to protest, but Nathaniel held up his hand to stop her. "I know it's overwhelming," he said gently, "but you've always trusted your instincts. Now it's time to share them with the world. I'll be there to support you every step of the way. You don't have to do this alone." Eleanor looked down at her hands, a flood of emotions rushing through her. "Why me?" she thought, but as the silence stretched on, something inside her stirred a feeling that this was a turning point. Nathaniel believed in her. He had faith in her abilities, even if she didn't yet have faith in herself. "I'll do it," she finally said, her voice shaking but resolute. "I'll speak at the conference." Nathaniel smiled, his eyes lighting up. "I knew you would. I'll help you prepare. Eleanor, you're going to change the way people think about food." The preparation over the next few days, Eleanor immersed herself in preparation. Nathaniel worked with her to craft the perfect presentation, focusing not only on her knowledge of flavors and culinary techniques, but also on her unique ability to intuitively break down food on a molecular level. As they met late into the evenings, Eleanor felt herself growing more confident. She had always trusted her instincts in the kitchen, but now those instincts were leading her into uncharted territory. The idea of sharing her process, her passion for food, and her methodical yet personal approach to flavor combination was terrifying but exhilarating too. Despite the fear, Eleanor began to embrace the challenge. As the days passed, she felt a strange sense of empowerment. She wasn't just a housekeeper anymore. She wasn't just an outsider in the world of high cuisine. She was someone with a voice that had the power to shape an industry. A shift in perspective one afternoon. As Eleanor was practicing her speech in the hotel's private dining room, she caught sight of a familiar figure, James Sullivan, the executive chef, who had been more distant than usual. The tension between the two had always been palpable, and even though he hadn't said much to her recently, Eleanor could tell he was still uncomfortable with her growing influence. James leaned against the doorway, watching her rehearse. She stopped mid-sentence, meeting his gaze. For a moment, there was nothing but silence between them. "You're really doing this, huh?" James finally said, his voice filled with a mix of disbelief and begrudging admiration. Eleanor stood up straight, folding her arms across her chest. "Yes, I am." James let out a low whistle, as if impressed despite himself. "I'll give you credit. You've got guts. Eleanor couldn't help but smile at the rare moment of acknowledgement. I'm not here to make friends, James. I'm here to make a difference. The air between them seemed to shift. James pushed off from the doorway and walked toward her. Just be careful, he warned, his tone softer now. This industry, it's not kind of people who don't have a solid foundation. It'll eat you up if you're not careful. Eleanor gave him a look that said everything. I've been eaten up before, James. I'm done letting that happen. For the first time since their tense working relationship had begun, Eleanor saw a flicker of something resembling respect in James's eyes. It was only a brief moment, but it was enough to make her believe that maybe, just maybe, she could win over the hardest critics of all. The night before the conference, Eleanor lay awake in her hotel room, staring at the ceiling. Her heart raced with a mix of nervousness and anticipation. She had come so far, but now the stakes were higher than ever. Her phone buzzed beside her, and when she looked, it was a message from Nathaniel. You've got this. I'm proud of you. Don't forget you're speaking not just for yourself, but for anyone who's ever doubted they belonged. This is your time. Eleanor smiled at the message, feeling the warmth of his support. It gave her the courage she needed to get out of bed and face the biggest challenge of her life. The conference would start the next morning, and Eleanor was ready. For the first time, she wasn't going to hide behind her doubts. She wasn't going to let fear control her. This time, she was going to own the stage, just as she had owned every meal she'd ever critiqued. And when the lights came up tomorrow, Eleanor would be ready to show the world that she belonged in the kitchen and in the world of the people who had doubted her. She took a deep breath, turned off the light, and closed her eyes, letting the confidence she'd cultivated in herself carry her to sleep. The world was about to change, and she was going to be the one to make it happen. The spotlight, the morning of the conference, arrived, and Eleanor could feel the weight of the day pressing down on her. She stood in front of the bathroom mirror, taking a long look at her reflection. Her palms were clammy, and her heart was racing, but beneath the nervousness, something else burned: determination. She was no longer the tired housekeeper scrubbing floors in a hotel. She was about to speak on one of the biggest culinary stages in the world, surrounded by some of the most influential chefs and food critics. A part of her couldn't quite believe how far she'd come, but another part of her, the part that had fought so hard to prove herself, knew that this was her moment. A new stage. As Eleanor walked into the conference hall, her eyes widened at the sheer scale of the event. The room was filled with hundreds of people, chefs in sharp uniforms, critics in designer clothes, and industry professionals chatting and laughing in tight-knit groups. Eleanor felt a pang of anxiety ripple through her, but she quickly shook it off. She belonged here. She had earned her spot. Nathaniel was waiting for her near the stage, his presence as steady and grounded as ever. When he saw her, he flashed her a reassuring smile. You look ready, he said, his voice calm and confident. Eleanor took a deep breath, willing herself to believe him. I hope I am. You are, Nathaniel replied with a wink. Now, just remember, trust your instincts and speak from the heart. With that, he gave her a final nod of encouragement before stepping aside to watch her walk onto the stage. As she took her first step toward the microphone, she felt the eyes of the entire room fall on her. It was a different kind of pressure, one that she had never experienced before. She reached the podium and took a deep breath. The microphone was slightly too high for her, but she didn't mind. She adjusted it, her hands steady despite the adrenaline pumping through her veins. When she spoke, her voice was clear, though there was a slight tremor. The presentation, good morning, Eleanor began, her eyes scanning the sea of faces. My name is Eleanor Dawson, and I'm here to talk about something that I believe is often overlooked in the culinary world: the power of intuition in food. The ability to truly understand flavors not just by taste, but by feel. She paused for a moment, letting the words sink in. The crowd was silent, waiting for her next move. She could feel the skepticism in the air, but it didn't faze her. She had learned to trust her instincts in the kitchen, and now she would trust them here. For years, I worked in housekeeping, she continued, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. Cleaning rooms, scrubbing toilets, making beds. But all along, I was noticing a pattern in the way food was prepared. It was in the coffee that tasted burnt, in the sauce that lacked balance, in the bread that wasn't quite fresh. And that's when I realized I wasn't just cleaning up messes. I was also noticing the mistakes people were making in the food they were serving. She could see the heads in the crowd turning slightly, some of the chefs raising their eyebrows in curiosity. This was exactly what she wanted. She wasn't here to just talk about her background. She was here to make them see her value. Eleanor moved closer to the microphone, leaning in slightly as she gathered the strength to continue. I can tell when something is wrong with a dish, not because of my training, but because of my intuition. I don't need to know the technical terms or understand every detail about food chemistry. I can just feel it. I can smell the burnt edges in the coffee. I can taste the over-roasted beans, and I can sense when a dish lacks the care it deserves. The room was quiet now, and Eleanor could feel the tension rise. She had their attention. "I know what some of you might be thinking," she said with a small smile. "You're probably wondering how a former housekeeper could understand something as complex as food. Well, I'm here to tell you it's not about the credentials. It's about paying attention to the details, to the subtleties that others miss. It's about trusting your gut, and in the kitchen, that's everything." She paused again, this time for dramatic effect. Her heart was pounding in her chest, but her words flowed with confidence. "You see, food isn't just about taste. It's about emotion. It's about creating something that resonates with people, something that makes them feel something deep inside. And when you trust your instincts, when you let yourself feel the flavors, that's when the magic happens." A breakthrough. Eleanor took a step back from the podium and let her words settle in the room. She could see the skepticism begin to fade as the audience processed her message. There were still some raised eyebrows, but there was also a quiet admiration building in the air. Nathaniel, watching from the sidelines, felt a surge of pride. He had always known that Eleanor had something special, something that no one in the culinary world had noticed before. Now everyone was starting to see it. As Eleanor continued with her presentation, she showcased examples of the hotel's food that she had improved, demonstrating her intuitive process. She talked about how she had worked with the chefs to fix dishes that had been underperforming, and how her unique approach had helped elevate the entire restaurant experience. She even shared a few of her personal techniques for identifying flaws in food that others might overlook, sparking a few conversations among the chefs in the crowd. By the end of her presentation, Eleanor felt something she hadn't expected. She felt empowered. She had faced her fears and stood tall in front of the most prestigious figures in the food industry, and she had delivered. The room erupted in applause, and for the first time, Eleanor truly believed that she had found her place in this world. As she stepped off the stage, her heart still racing, Nathaniel was there to greet her, his expression one of pure pride. "You did it," he said, his voice warm with admiration. Eleanor smiled, her eyes shining. "I did, didn't I?" Nathaniel nodded. "You've changed the game, Eleanor. You've shown them all what real talent looks like." Eleanor felt a wave of relief wash over her. But more than that, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years, a deep sense of belonging. A new beginning. The conference continued, but Eleanor knew that she had made her mark. She had taken a leap of faith, trusting in her instincts and her passion for food. And in doing so, she had not only won over the culinary elite, but had also found a new sense of confidence in herself. Later that evening, as the conference came to a close, Nathaniel and Eleanor shared a quiet moment together in a secluded corner of the event hall. Nathaniel raised his glass to her, his smile full of pride. "To new beginnings," he said. Eleanor clinked her glass with his, her heart full. "To trusting yourself," she replied. And for the first time in a long time, Eleanor knew that whatever came next, she was ready for it. She had found her place, and it was just the beginning of a new chapter in her life. The price of success. The days after the conference were a blur of new meetings, opportunities, and a growing sense of achievement. Eleanor had stepped into a world she had never imagined, surrounded by the finest chefs, critics, and restaurateurs. She had proven herself in front of them all, and now her career was unfolding in ways she had never expected. But with all of this success came new challenges. Nathaniel continued to support her, but the pressure of maintaining the hotel's newfound reputation weighed heavily on both of them. Eleanor's insights into food had elevated the hotel's dining experience, and the executive team had begun taking her suggestions more seriously. As Nathaniel had predicted, Eleanor's ability to sense flaws in flavors and dishes had helped turn around a hotel that had been struggling to maintain its five-star status. But Eleanor quickly learned that there was no rest for the successful. She spent her days overseeing menu changes, assisting the executive chefs, and learning the intricacies of high-end cuisine. It was exhilarating, but also exhausting. And through it all, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was still an outsider, an imposter in a world that wasn't meant for her. The chefs who once doubted her were now slowly beginning to accept her ideas, but there were still murmurs behind her back. Despite her growing reputation, Eleanor couldn't ignore the growing tension in the kitchen. Chef James Sullivan, who had initially mocked her for being a housekeeper, still maintained a cold distance. He would often question her judgment, even when her observations were right. Eleanor was no longer just a housekeeper. She had a title now, and yet she still had to prove her worth to people who saw her as someone less than. It wasn't just the chefs. As Eleanor navigated her new role, she realized that there were people higher up in the hotel's management who were watching her every move, evaluating whether her success was just a fluke or if she could continue to maintain the hotel's newly elevated reputation. The more she proved herself, the more they began to expect. The pressure of perfection weighed heavily on her. She wasn't just influencing the food. Now, she was expected to inspire others to replicate the success she had brought to the hotel's kitchens. But Eleanor didn't back down. She had fought too hard to get where she was, and she wasn't about to let anyone, especially someone like James, knock her down. The competition, both from within and outside the hotel, kept her on her toes. But Eleanor had learned something invaluable: confidence. Every day, she faced a new challenge, but each one pushed her to become more assured of her own abilities. One particularly grueling afternoon, after several hours of reviewing dishes, tweaking menus, and overseeing the preparation of a new dish she had recommended, Eleanor walked into her office to find a familiar sight: Nathaniel standing by the window, looking out at the city. She took a deep breath and entered, shutting the door softly behind her. A moment of doubt. "You look tired," Nathaniel said, his voice soft as he turned to face her. Eleanor gave a small smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm fine. Just a lot going on." Nathaniel stepped forward and leaned against the desk, studying her. "You've been working nonstop. You know, you don't have to carry all of this by yourself." Eleanor shook her head, her expression serious. "I know, but if I don't push myself, I'll lose this opportunity. I can't afford to fail now." Nathaniel's brow furrowed. "You won't fail. You've already proved that." But Eleanor didn't share his confidence. She had spent too many years fighting for recognition, fighting to be seen as someone who deserved more than just the ordinary life she had once known. Now, in the world she had entered, she was more determined than ever to prove her worth. And that meant pushing herself beyond her limits. She sank into the chair behind her desk and let out a long sigh. "I just don't know how much longer I can keep this up. It feels like everything's moving so fast. There's so much riding on me." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment before he sat down beside her. "Eleanor, you've been carrying this hotel's reputation for months. You've turned it around in ways people didn't think were possible. But you're only human. You can't do it all on your own. Let me help." For a brief moment, Eleanor allowed herself to feel the weight of Nathaniel's words. She had always been so focused on proving herself that she hadn't realized just how much of the burden she had taken on. Maybe it was time to share the load. "I don't know how to stop," Eleanor admitted quietly. "I don't know how to let go of the pressure. What if everything crumbles? What if all of this success was just luck?" Nathaniel's eyes softened, and he placed a hand on hers. "Success is never just luck, Eleanor. It's about vision, persistence, and heart. And you have all of those things. You've earned your place here. Don't let your doubts take that away from you." Eleanor looked at him, her heart pounding in her chest. The words were simple, but they struck a chord deep within her. Maybe she didn't need to prove herself every single day. Maybe it was okay to admit that she wasn't invincible. Maybe it was okay to lean on someone for support. A difficult choice over the next few weeks, the pressure only grew. Eleanor's role had expanded even further, with more responsibilities piled onto her plate. Nathaniel continued to offer support, but she felt the distance between them growing. He was always there, yet something had shifted. Maybe it was the constant strain of her work, or maybe it was the fear that she was getting too close to something or someone she wasn't sure she could handle. Eleanor had noticed Nathaniel's restlessness. He was more distant, more preoccupied with his hotel empire than ever. It was as if the two of them, who had once been allies in this high-end culinary venture, were now moving in separate directions. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was slipping through her fingers. And then came the phone call that would change everything. The hotel had been nominated for a prestigious culinary award, and Eleanor had been selected as the face of the campaign. It was the ultimate recognition, the peak of all the hard work she had put in. But there was a catch: she would have to fly across the world for several months, making appearances at events, interviews, and culinary challenges. The decision seemed like a dream come true. But as she stared at the email on her screen, her mind raced. Could she really leave everything behind, including Nathaniel, when she had just begun to truly understand what she wanted in life? Would her success in the culinary world mean sacrificing everything she had worked so hard to build with him? Her phone buzzed again, but this time it wasn't an email. It was a message from Nathaniel. "We need to talk." Eleanor stared at the message for a long time. She knew that the moment was coming, the moment where everything she had built would be tested. But she wasn't sure if she was ready for the consequences. The question hung in the air. Was she ready to choose between her career and the person who had believed in her from the very beginning? The crossroads of destiny, the decision that Eleanor had been avoiding, had finally arrived. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a simple message from Nathaniel. "We need to talk." She stared at the words, feeling a knot form in her stomach. She had known this conversation was coming, but now that it was here, she wasn't sure if she was ready for it. It had been months since she had stepped into the world of high-end culinary arts, and in that time, she had built a reputation that went beyond anything she had ever dreamed of. She had proven herself, not just to the critics, but to herself. But now, standing at the precipice of a new chapter, one that could elevate her career to new heights, she was torn. The opportunity to represent the hotel in a global culinary competition was a once-in-a-lifetime chance, but it would mean leaving behind everything she had built with Nathaniel. Or perhaps it was the other way around, leaving behind the very thing she had been fighting for all these months. She had spent countless nights wondering if she was doing the right thing. Nathaniel had become more than just her employer. He had become someone she relied on. They had built something together, something that had given her a sense of purpose. But the moment was rapidly approaching when she would have to decide if she was willing to risk it all for her future, or whether the future she had already built was enough. A moment of clarity. Eleanor arrived at Nathaniel's office later that afternoon, her heart racing with each step. The hotel, as always, was a flurry of activity around her, but today, everything seemed distant. She felt like she was stepping into a new world, a world where decisions carried weight, where the stakes were higher than they had ever been before. Nathaniel's office door was slightly ajar, and she knocked softly before pushing it open. Nathaniel was standing by the window, looking out over the city. The city was busy, filled with people living their lives, but to Eleanor, everything felt like it was happening in slow motion. She didn't know what she was walking into, but she knew that this conversation would change everything. Nathaniel turned as she entered, his expression unreadable. "Eleanor," he said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that made her stomach churn. "We need to talk about what comes next." She nodded, stepping into the room, her mind racing. She had spent so much time thinking about what she wanted to say, but now that the moment was here, words seemed to escape her. Instead, she simply sat down across from him, hoping that somehow the right words would come to her. Nathaniel didn't sit at his desk like usual. Instead, he came around and took a seat across from her, his gaze locked onto hers. "I've been thinking a lot about your future," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "And I think it's time we make a decision." Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. She had expected this conversation, but the reality of it was still unsettling. She had done everything in her power to prove herself, and now it felt like it was all coming to a head. "I've received the final details of the competition," Nathaniel continued, breaking the silence. "You've been selected to represent the hotel, to compete for the best culinary experience in the world. This is a huge opportunity for you. It's your chance to take everything you've worked for and turn it into something global." Eleanor swallowed hard. The competition was an amazing opportunity, but it would require her to step away from everything she had come to rely on. It would mean months away from the hotel, away from Nathaniel, and a world that had become more than just her job. It had become her life. "I know it's a big decision," Nathaniel said, his voice softer now, "but you've earned it. You've proved yourself time and time again, not just to me, but to everyone who's been watching. You have what it takes to go all the way. But I need to know, are you ready to take that step?" Eleanor stared at him, the weight of his words sinking in. She had always dreamed of achieving greatness, of being more than just a housekeeper, of being seen for the talent she knew she had. But now that she had it, now that the chance was within her grasp, she felt unsure. She had come so far from that tired woman scrubbing floors and cleaning hotel rooms. She had fought for every opportunity, every chance to prove herself. But what had it all been for? Was it for the recognition, the glory, or was it for something more? Was it for the feeling of being valued, of belonging? And then there was Nathaniel. Over the months, their relationship had evolved from that of employer and employee to something far more complex. There had been moments, subtle moments, when Eleanor felt like he was beginning to care for her in a way that went beyond the professional. The support he had shown her, the way he had believed in her from the very beginning, had made her start to wonder if there was more between them than just work. But was she willing to risk that, too? Was she willing to let go of the connection they had, the trust they had built? A heartfelt confession. Eleanor took a deep breath. She had been thinking about it for weeks, and now it was time to face the truth. "Nathaniel," she said softly, looking at him with a seriousness he hadn't seen in her before, "I don't know if I can leave. I don't know if I'm ready to risk everything I've built here, everything we've built together." Nathaniel's eyes softened. "I understand," he said quietly, "but this is your chance to take everything you've worked for and turn it into something bigger. Don't let fear hold you back." "I'm not afraid," Eleanor said, her voice shaky, "but I'm not sure I can handle losing everything I've worked so hard for here with you." The silence in the room was palpable. Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable, before he stood up and walked over to the window. Eleanor could feel the tension rising between them, but she knew that this was a moment they both had to face. "Nathaniel," Eleanor started, but Nathaniel raised a hand to stop her. "No, Eleanor," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "This isn't just about me, and it's not just about you. It's about what you want, what you're willing to sacrifice, and what you're willing to achieve. I've always believed in you, but now you need to believe in yourself." The words stung, but they also brought a sense of clarity. Eleanor had been so focused on the decision between her career and Nathaniel that she had lost sight of what was most important, her own path. The decision wasn't just about what she stood to gain or lose in terms of her work. It was about what she needed for herself. "I don't know what comes next," Eleanor admitted, her voice trembling. "But I do know one thing: I can't let fear keep me from chasing my dreams. I've worked too hard for this, and I won't let anything stand in my way." Nathaniel turned to face her, a look of pride in his eyes. "Then go," he said simply. "But no matter where you go or what you do, know that I'll always be here. We've both come too far to let this go, Eleanor. We both have the potential to do something incredible. Don't forget that." The road ahead, the moment passed, but Eleanor knew that her life would never be the same. She had made her decision not just to pursue her career, but to take control of her own destiny. She was no longer the woman who lived in fear, uncertain of her place in the world. She was now someone who understood the value of her own talent and the importance of having the courage to follow it. Nathaniel's eyes followed her as she stood up, ready to face the challenges that lay ahead. And though she wasn't sure what the future held, One thing was clear. Eleanor Dawson was no longer just a housekeeper. She was a force to be reckoned with, and the world was about to see just how far she could go. Thank you so much for watching until the end. I hope you enjoyed Eleanor's incredible journey of transformation and how she defied all odds to prove her worth. If you liked the video, please give it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe to Stories TH for more amazing content. See you next time.